Our first speaker is Jag Davies from the Drug Policy Alliance. There he is, waving at me, assuring me he's here. I'm going to read his bio to you. Jag is Director of Communication Strategy at the Drug Policy Alliance DPA, the nation's leading organization promoting drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. DPA has played a pivotal role in most of the major drug policy reforms in the U.S. on issues such as excuse me, medical marijuana and marijuana legalization, criminal justice and sentencing reform, and health-based approaches to reduce the death, disease, crime, and suffering associated with both drug use and drug prohibition. One of my favorite organizations, and for many, many years. JAG oversees the organization's messaging and visual identity and manages the development and production of publications, donor communications, advocacy materials, reports, multimedia, digital communications, and messaging research. He is regularly quoted in a wide range of media outlets, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC.com, CNN.com, and dozens of regional and online publications. Before joining DPA in 2009, JAG served as Director of Communications for MAPS and as policy researcher for the ACLU, Drug Law Reform Project, where he coordinated local, state, federal, and international efforts to end punitive drug policies that cause the widespread violation of constitutional and human rights. So Jag is a well-informed voice who's going to tell us about the future of psychedelics and psychedelic policy. Jag Davies.
Right, thank you so much for being here so bright and early. I'm always impressed by who shows up first thing on a Sunday morning at a psychedelics conference. So I am here today to talk about what does the end of psychedelic criminalization look like. I think people in these settings have a variety of different backgrounds and political perspectives, but I think we can all agree that our current public policies around psychedelics are not serving us well, and in fact, in many cases, are doing great harm. And I've been lucky enough to have a career working in both the psychedelic research advocacy world and more recently in the broader drug policy reform world. And so this is a question that I've pondered for many years, and I think now is a really important time for us to think about how we can build a world where ending the criminalization of psychedelics makes sense, and how we can do that in a way that is socially just and that repairs the harms of prohibition and includes the people who have been harmed the most under psychedelic prohibition. I've been thinking about this actually since I first started experimenting with psychedelics. I think about the second or third time I took acid when I was 18, I had my first bad trip. And I was at a friend's house with another friend. We got kicked out. Me and my friend drove off in my car. It was maybe an hour after I'd taken it, and I really did not know much about psychedelics, about their risks or its benefits. And I'm driving off in my car, and all of a sudden I just feel these like waves of paranoia and self-consciousness coming over me. It was dark, it was at night. There were police sirens everywhere. Of course, I shouldn't have gotten in a car. And one of the things about that experience, there are many things that were very interesting, but one of them was that my friend who I was with is Black, and I felt this really deep sense of empathy for him. And as we were driving around and I was feeling paranoid, thinking about what it must be like to exist in the world in a Black body, and particularly as a Black person who uses drugs, and how that's different from a white person who uses drugs. And like much of my life, I got lucky and we ended up fine that night. We went and sat by the water and ended up kind of having a fairly transcendental experience. But I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't able to talk to anyone about it. I didn't talk to my parents or other people I cared about. I didn't know what to make of it until I was lucky enough a year later to meet Rick Doblin during my first year of college and to study with him soon after that and start working at MAPS. And I kind of just, by dumb luck, showed up at the right place at the right time. In the early 2000s, of course, that was the end of a 30-year blackout on psychedelic research. These researchers and people like Rick through the 70s and 80s and 90s had been fighting and trying and mostly not being able to pursue the research that they wanted to. And it was such a smart strategic decision at that point to focus on the medical approach as a way in. But I started to feel after a few years of working at MAPS, like the work that I was doing was only going to benefit a privileged few, and that ultimately there were so many larger problems associated with drug prohibition that were so urgent that I felt compelled to move into working on criminal justice reform and broader drug policy reform. Just to put I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but to put the facts out there, more than 40 million people have been arrested over the past 30 years simply for a drug law violation. And those people are don't look like the people in this room. They're disproportionately Black. They're disproportionately Latino. They're disproportionately people who are poor and at the margins of society. There's so much harm coming from that I felt like I had to do something about that. I kind of showed up at the right place at the right time. In 2009, marijuana legalization was still not really considered a mainstream political issue. But in 2012 and 2014, as you know, 4 states legalized marijuana, and now it's become a mainstream political issue. And so the Drug Policy Alliance, we don't just work on, about a third of our work is on marijuana. I'd say about a third of it is on broader criminal justice issues and ending criminalization of drug use more broadly. And then another third of that is working on public health and harm reduction initiatives to actually implement the health-based approaches that we would want to see in the world. And ultimately, our goal is to move drug policy as far away from a criminalization approach and as much as possible towards a health-based approach. So that means both on a more abstract level, changing society's fundamental perceptions about drugs, but then it also means pragmatically working in states and localities and in Congress, working all over the country with the key stakeholders in drug policy, law enforcement, public health professionals, the people who have skin in the game, to gradually move drug policy along that spectrum towards less criminalization. And when it comes to mass incarceration the past few years, like marijuana legalization, it's become a mainstream political issue. It was something you would never hear out of a politician's lips 5 years ago. And now you have in not just even the Democratic presidential debates, even in the Republican presidential debates, you had several candidates saying things that were actually surprisingly reasonable, like drug use should be treated as a health issue and we can't arrest our way out of the drug addiction problem. So we're at this really interesting moment where the rhetoric and public opinion has shifted a lot around drug policy, but in terms of the machinery of the drug war, it is grinding on the same as ever. There are still the same amount of people as 10 years ago, 1.5 million people getting arrested simply for a drug law violation every year, and most of those are just for about 80%, or a little more than 80% of those are just for possession. It's more than about 1.25 million people getting arrested just for drug possession every year. So it's an odd dichotomy between the political rhetoric and the reality right now. And if you'll allow me to get philosophical for a moment, I think part of the reason for that is that there's still a fundamental dualism in the way that people think about drugs, of dividing drugs into good and bad categories. And associating those values with the people who use them. I think it's important for us to realize as people who care about psychedelics that many of the same myths and drug war ideologies that cause psychedelic prohibition are also at the root of the prohibition of other substances. I often like to make the point, just because people don't believe me a lot of the time, that more than 80% of people who try crack cocaine, for example, do not go on to get addicted and have a problem with it. That's according to the federal government's own data. But you wouldn't know that, because the people who you see, the small sample of people who we see, are the people who are at the margins of society and are suffering the worst harms of it. And the same problem applies with psychedelics. I would guess that probably just about everyone in the country knows someone who has benefited from psychedelics, or has at least used psychedelics in a non-problematic way. But most people don't know they know someone who has used psychedelics. And the same thing applies to other drugs. Everyone here probably knows a functional heroin user. You just might not know that you know a functional heroin user, because there's so much stigma that is related to criminalization that changes our perception of drug users and who uses drugs. So we need to be aware, I think, especially in this community, of what I might call drug exceptionalism, and throwing people under the bus who prefer to use other substances as well. And I think ultimately that is going to make our movement much stronger. My academic background is in anthropology, and I was really interested in sort of the idea of consciousness evolution and how psychedelics could play a sort of beneficial role in that. And so I went back and I did a lot of research into looking at historical examples of societies who have used psychedelics. And I was actually kind of disappointed, because in just about every instance historically where psychedelics have been integrated into society, they've been used to uphold the social hierarchy, which isn't always a good thing. They've often been used to justify misogyny and violence. One of my favorite examples is the Vikings in Europe, who would eat Amanita muscaria mushrooms before going and raiding villages. It would prepare them for war. So I think that just shows how culturally dependent our understanding of drugs are. And that as mind-expanding as psychedelics may be, they don't completely allow us to leave the framework, the cultural framework that we bring to them. And so when we think about reducing the harms of psychedelic criminalization, and we think, what is the world, what do we want the world to look like in 10 years, in 20 years? I think for me, the biggest thing at the root of it is removing the criminal element to it. And I think ultimately, probably most people in this room would want some form of legal access to psychedelics. I don't have a lot of strong opinions about exactly what that would look like, but I think most people here would want, if they wanted to use a psychedelic outside of a medical setting, would like to be able to do that without having to become criminalized. So, and ultimately, we want to move psychedelics, even if it's gradually, as far as possible from one side from the criminalization spectrum and to a health-based spectrum. And there's a lot of different nuances along the way, and there's not just one or two models in between. There's thousands. So the thing is right now, of course, is that polling for over-the-counter legalization of psychedelics is quite low. It's around 10%, which is actually down there with like crack cocaine and methamphetamine. So even though it seems to us in our circles that the public's perception of psychedelics has changed a lot. In the big picture, we still have a very long way to go. And I think it's also worth just pointing out here that I think the model probably that from speaking with people at this conference and conferences like it seems like the model that people really want is a cognitive liberty model, where we have freedom of thought, and more so than even just a medical liberty model. But it's worth emphasizing that polling for cognitive liberty does not do very well. That is a core principle of DPA. That's in our mission statement, that no one should be punished for anything they put into their own body, absent harm to others. Unfortunately, I specialize in communications and messaging research and stuff like that. And when we do very nuanced messaging research about drug policy with, say, the swing voter demographic, the personal autonomy arguments do not go over well. So also to build that support for a larger cognitive liberty model is going to take some time. But there are a few things that do have majority public support that we're already working on that would greatly, greatly reduce the harms of psychedelic prohibition. So one of those things is decriminalization, which means ending arrests and criminal penalties for use and possession of psychedelics. So legalization means that the production and distribution is also legalized and regulated. With decriminalization, it just means that no one can be brought into the criminal justice system simply for using or possessing a personal amount of a substance. And this is something that's already been implemented in many places with fantastic success. The most well-known example is Portugal. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs, and they've been studied extensively since then. Drug use did not go up, which is the first thing that people often mistakenly assume will happen. Drug addiction went drastically down because people who wanted to be able to get help for problematic drug use felt much more comfortable being able to get that help. Also things like overdoses and drug-related HIV and Hep C transmissions went drastically down. Also, the Czech Republic and several other European countries have similar policies. And in the US, we're moving very close to that point. As I said before, you already have, the woman who's about to become president saying that drug use should be treated as a health issue. So the political rhetoric is there. Early this year, we did a number of polls in primary states in Maine, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And even in South Carolina, we found that 60% of Democratic and Republican primary voters supported ending arrests for drug possession. So the public is already there in a lot of ways, and in a lot of jurisdictions we're taking big steps towards ending arrests. In Maryland just this past year, a legislator introduced the country's first full drug decriminalization bill. But unfortunately, there's still 34 states where drug possession is not just a crime, it's a felony. So I think it's really interesting that I often hear people say in these settings, oh, people don't really get arrested for psychedelics, and that seems to be a very common perception. And first of all, I don't think that's true. There are definitely thousands of people getting arrested every year for psychedelics. And in the big picture of the drug war, where you have 1.5 million drug arrests, it's a small amount of that, but when you think of how few people actually use psychedelics, it's a significant amount. And I think it's just very interesting. I've been kind of waiting for someone else to talk about this for years. I think it's just fascinating that no one talks about ending arrests for psychedelics in these settings. And of course, that has a lot to do with the demographic complexion of the room and the privilege that people here bring to the room. And, I think we also need to just recognize that even if you're not worried about getting arrested, you're not worried about other people getting arrested, there is a psychological cost to prohibition and to criminalization. When you know that the thing you're doing is criminal, I think it probably detracts from a lot of the benefits of it. And then it also, if you do have problems or do need to get help or do have challenges even, it makes that much harder when you're a criminal. So I think that's something that we need to really look inside ourselves about why that hasn't been more of a priority for this movement, and to understand that it's not a mutually exclusive thing, that research, that we don't need to decide on just a medical model or just a legalization model, or that it's not always completely linear. Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there were jurisdictions passing marijuana decriminalization laws and laws to make marijuana a lowest law enforcement priority at the same time that people were also fighting for medical marijuana. And it was a coalescence of all those factors that led public opinion to change to reach the point where, now marijuana legalization is on the table. Another thing we can do that we're already have a lot of traction on to greatly reduce the harms of prohibition is sentencing reform. For people who are arrested for and convicted of producing or distributing psychedelics, the mandatory minimum sentences apply. So regardless of the circumstance, you can easily get slapped with 10, 20, 30 years behind bars. And this is still continuing apace. And for sentencing reform, there's even higher public support than decriminalization. I mean, it's in the 70, 80% range, even majorities among Republicans. This is one of the few issues in Congress that the Republicans and Democrats actually have some common ground on for different reasons, which is another story. But we have to, I don't want to wait until, psychedelic therapy is approved in 10 or 20 years to stop this stream of thousands of people every year getting cycled into the criminal justice system, especially considering those people are people that are less privileged than us and are more likely to be at the margins of society and that have historically suffered the worst harms of prohibition and the drug war. Another really important big thing that we can do to reduce the harms of psychedelic prohibition is working with institutions where psychedelics are used to end zero tolerance policies there and to end arrests there and to implement harm reduction practices. So some of you may have heard my colleague Stephanie Jones, who spoke here last year. She spoke about DPA's Safer Partying program. It works with universities, festivals, nightlife venues to reduce the role of the criminal justice system at those events, and also to mainstream and normalize on-site mental health services like MAPS's Zendo project, drug checking like the organization Dance Safe is doing, so that people know if they're have some idea what's in the drugs they're taking. And so though there's already quite a lot of things we can be doing that can drastically cut back on the harms of prohibition while we work towards approving psychedelic therapy. And I think when it comes to building a broader vision and really softening the ground for something beyond even decriminalization or sentencing reform or a very strict medical approach to psychedelics, there's a lot of things we can do to soften the ground to change public opinion. So one of those things is people speaking out about their own experiences. It's been really fascinating and exciting to see things like the Psychedelics Because campaign and all of the psychedelic societies that have popped up over the past few years that are working to have these conversations and to build bridges with different stakeholders in their communities. Because that's one of the things, of course, that is most likely to change people's minds when they know someone who has benefited from psychedelics. And it's worth saying that coming out campaigns are not that simple, because when you have something that's illegal like drug use, not everyone can do that. If you have kids, if you have had previous involvement with the criminal justice system, if you have a job that would be threatened by it, if your home would be threatened by coming out, a lot of people really can't come out. So for those of us who are lucky and privileged enough to be able to do that, I think it's even more important, and there's really an onus on us to do that. Another thing Another thing that's very important is to continue promoting research and not censoring it. It's mind-boggling to me how impressive all of the research is that's been going on and how much of it has taken off over the past 10 years, but it is a tightrope. It is a really hard tightrope. These people are not getting funding from government agencies. They're having to get approval from the DEA, from the FDA, from their institutions. They're having to be very careful about what research topics they choose, and there's a cost to that. And so I think we need to continue to not just promote research, but promote opening up a more open dialogue around the science, the politics of science, so that we can be so that more broad research can happen. Because we need to, if you think about how are we gonna get from that 10% to 50%, a lot of people, just like probably a lot of us, we have a lot of myths that we carry with us about certain substances that are vestiges of the drug war. And so we need to continue educating people about their traditional uses. We also need to really think through cultural models for psychedelics. One of the most fascinating things, of course, the past few years has been the explosion of ayahuasca in the US. And in 2006, there was a Supreme Court ruling that protected certain organized religions that use ayahuasca. But it's important to recognize that that was a fairly limited ruling, and the legal definition of what an organized religion is very, very narrow. So many of the groups in this country that are practicing ayahuasca, even in a very organized format, are not protected by the law. Fortunately, that hasn't been a huge problem here in terms of criminal justice enforcement, but in a lot of countries, other countries, it has been. I should mention the work of ICEERS, the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Services. They started something recently called the Ayahuasca Legal Defense Fund, and they're working with groups that are being prosecuted around the world to build a legal case for using ayahuasca, and not just under a religious model or cultural, not just a religious model or a medical model, but also under a cultural model. So ultimately, we need to think about how we can build the world in a way that promotes our values. One interesting example is the marijuana industry that we're working with right now. That was sort of a byproduct of ending marijuana prohibition. And the main reason, I should say, that we worked on ending marijuana prohibition is not necessarily to create a legal industry, but to end the 500,000 arrests that are taking place in this country every year, and the costs that come with that. And we have a situation now where in many places, even the states where it's been legalized, we still have young Black and Latino people being brought into the criminal justice system for selling marijuana outside of the legal system. And then we have all these wealthy business people coming in from Wall Street and making money and getting rich doing the same thing that for decades young Black and Latino people have been catastrophically harmed for. And so I think we need to think through that analogy in thinking through what the end of psychedelic prohibition looks like. Like how weird would it be and sad would it be if we ended up in a world where psychedelic therapy is legal for wealthy white people in the North, while the people in the world who have been harmed the greatest by prohibition still are criminalized for these substances. And we need to realize that, like, diversity, racial diversity and gender diversity, it's not just a token thing. It's not an optics thing. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's not just the right thing to do. I think it's the smart thing to do, pragmatically, politically, to build a movement that is going to last and stand the test of time. It's very important to recognize that political change happens through a variety of channels. It usually doesn't just happen through one group of people deciding on one very specific approach. It usually comes from a lot of different angles. And ultimately, if we want to build a world that reflects our values, I think now is a really important time to reflect on the potential unintended consequences of the system that we're creating, and to make sure that we don't perpetuate the social inequities that gave rise to the prohibition of psychedelics in the first place. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jag. Jag Davies. We have some time for Q&A now.
I saw a letter from the DEA that Ben Delonen showed me that was addressed to a Native American church that was serving ayahuasca, pretending to have the exemption without having the exemption. But so the DEA wrote, why don't you guys ask for the exemption? Rather than arresting them, he actually encouraged them to ask for exemption. So I want to know, are you aware of that? And is the DEA change, I mean, what is the position? Or just to be really direct, what advice do you have for a shaman who wants to open a temple up somewhere in New York? I mean, would you recommend first to do a church and then ask for the exemption? Do the church and ask for the exemption at the same time, or stay underground?
Well, you know, honestly, I'm not a lawyer or legal expert, so I really am not qualified to answer that question about exactly what provisions would I recommend taking for someone starting an ayahuasca church in the US. I would recommend looking at the model that the União de Vegetal Church created. You know, it wasn't an accident that they won their Supreme Court case. They had planned for that for years and set it up in a very specific way to make sure that they met the legal definition of a church in the US, which is very, very narrow. So I would recommend, yeah, there was this one example in Washington recently. There were all these ads and articles online. You know, first legal ayahuasca church opens up in the US, and they were taking all this money from people. And so the ayahuasca industry is very messy right now. And a lot of people, because a lot of people are not very aware of what the legal standing is, people are trying to take advantage of that ambiguity and saying that they're legal. And, you know, in that one case I know of, at least, these people were advertising themselves as being a legal ayahuasca church, even though it didn't seem, there was no indication that they actually were.
I'm having trouble reconciling the polling numbers that are very much against personal autonomy and cognitive liberty, which are kind of in the toilet, with the polling numbers of supporting decriminalization. And I'm really hoping you could shed some insight in the psychology and politics that goes on there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think it has a lot to do is when you're talking about ending arrests, it's within a framework of I think the reason a lot of conservatives support that is because it's more efficient. You know, you're not wasting money. You know, the police can focus on violent crime and things that are more difficult. You know, it is interesting though, because I think, you know, in the polling for that question, it said drugs. I think if we had separated out and said methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and LSD or something, it definitely would have been less, because there are such still sort of deep-seated notions that people have around those specific substances. But a lot of it is about an efficient use of criminal justice resources, and it's about devoting the, you know, when we're framing it for like the general public in, say, South Carolina, you know, and it's about promoting public health and freeing resources up to help get people into drug treatment, rather than devoting those resources to putting them behind bars. But that doesn't mean that people think those, you know, don't still carry, just because someone supports decriminalizing drugs doesn't mean that they necessarily don't also believe a lot of the stigmatizing myths that are associated with those drugs. It's more just like a pragmatic thing. Do you think that makes sense?
It misses the colossal irony of the opposition to personal autonomy.
Could you repeat that question, Jack? Could you repeat what he just said, please?
Yeah, that's a great answer. You know, the elephant in the room is the colossal irony that of the great opposition to personal autonomy and cognitive liberty in what is allegedly the most free country, the land of the free.
Comment? Other questions?
Hi.
Rita.
I got a mic, can I go? You spoke to the potential pitfalls of people who have already been marginalized being further marginalized by wealthy, over here, right by the pole, being further marginalized by the arrival of wealthy white people to take over the industries that have been in place. Do you have perhaps any prospective strategies we could use to avoid?
Can you repeat that a little louder?
So you talked to the pitfalls of further marginalizing communities that have already been marginalized by prohibition, just by wealthy white people coming in and taking over industries that have already been in place, as in people coming over and selling.
I would correct that. I would say it's not further marginalizing those people, because marginalizing because we're still cutting back on rest in a long way, but it's not. It's not further, marijuana legalization under its current system is not further marginalizing people of color, but it is keeping in place the dichotomy in the current system and the access to economic opportunity.
That's a fair position,
yeah.
Thank you. So how could we avoid similar structures being set up as we move forward in psychedelic legalization, this sort of gentrification of drugs?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to, there's a number of things. I think, yeah, it's who is in the room, who is being empowered by the key stakeholders in this movement. But I think it's also prioritizing ending the harms of criminalization, because I think to people who are suffering those, telling them that, you know, well, psychedelics might be descheduled in 20 years, that's not really helping them. So I think it's finding out, actually talking to those people and finding out what they want. And I don't even necessarily know what the answer is, because yeah, no one's tried.
Question over here.
Hi, over here. You discussed the importance of increasing the dialogue around psychedelic experiences to kind of shape public perspective on it. And I think that that's a really interesting concept, but it strikes me that it's really important to walk that fine line in presenting those experiences in a way that creates positive elements. So how would you, what elements would you avoid in presenting those dialogues, and what elements would you emphasize to create the best fostering of public perception?
Yeah, that's a good question. You certainly don't want to reinforce people's negative stereotypes about psychedelics and trying to overcome them. I think we need to do it in a very cautious way and really, again, meet people where they're at, really listen to people's fears. I think if you just try and hit people over the head with the message that you think they need to hear, it's going to be cognitively dissonant, and people may not aren't going to fully take it in. So I think a lot of it, and it's knowing your audience. You know, it depends. If you're talking to a doctor, it's very different than talking to someone in a different from a different background. So I think, you know, as a communications professional, one of the ways we work is by segmenting our audiences. You know, that's what companies do, and nonprofits are starting to do that now too, where you don't just create a message for the general public. You figure out, okay, which audiences are kind of our low-hanging fruit that like should be with us but aren't quite there with us yet, and then talk to them and figure out what how you can help them, and then then they'll be open, a lot more open to your message.
Two quick questions for you. First, you know, the research that was being done with psychedelics in the 50s and 60s then led to a widespread counterculture psychedelic movement, and then there was the repressive atmosphere and the clamping down by the government. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what sort of lingering effects that might have, you know, in the context today, whether that affects the willingness of the research community or the psychedelic user community to politicize the cause. And the second question is, you spoke about representation, black communities, Latino communities. I'm wondering if you've ever come across or conducted yourself any data that looks at whether psychedelic use is similarly proportional in those communities compared to in white communities.
Yeah, as Jesse had noted yesterday, the Monitoring the Future study and the government studies about hallucinogens, which is what they call them, are very limited because it only groups it into these categories. So I would reference that data. I think historically it's been a little bit lower, but it's not among people who are non-white, but it's not insignificant. And also, of course, that data is not necessarily reliable because it's based on self-reporting. But historically, when it comes to just about all drug use in this country and drug selling as well, studies have consistently shown over decades that rates of use are very, very similar along racial lines. But of course, the enforcement is vastly disproportionate.
I have a comment. I think that the political way of psychedelic policy reform has a very poor track record, and I think that we need to start thinking somehow outside of politics.
I would just finish by saying the political is personal, and if we don't make the political personal, we're not going to succeed very well. So that's what I would say to that.
Jag Davies. Jag, thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. Wonderful talk. Thank you.